Most Americans drive past the Arthur Kill every day without ever knowing what sleeps beneath its surface. Trains rattle over bridges. Cars glide along highways. Cargo ships move quietly toward the Atlantic. And beneath all of it, half buried in black mud and cold water, lies one of the greatest forgotten collections of American history ever assembled by accident. This is not a myth. This is not a legend. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a graveyard of steel. More than 100 abandoned ships, tugboats, barges, fireboats, ferry hulls, and wartime vessels rest silently between Staten Island and New Jersey. Some once guided soldiers to war. Some carried coal that powered New York City. Some fought fires that could have erased entire neighborhoods. Others hauled garbage, oil, weapons, or secrets no one ever wrote down. They were not sunk in battle. They were not honored with ceremonies. They were simply left. And in being left behind, they became something far more unsettling than wrecks. They became witnesses. During World War II, New York Harbor was the busiest port on Earth. Day and night, vessels moved in endless lines. Liberty ships, tankers, troop carriers, and supply barges filled the water like floating cities. Tugboats, small, powerful, and largely invisible to history, worked without pause, pushing, pulling, guiding, and rescuing. These tugboats had no glory. They had no headlines. But without them, America's war effort would have collapsed before it ever crossed the Atlantic. In thick fog, through ice-choked winters, under blackout conditions meant to hide the city from enemy submarines, tugboat crews navigated blind. They memorized currents. They trusted sound more than sight. They worked 18-hour shifts, slept in short bursts, and returned to the water before their bodies had fully recovered. Some never went home. And when the war ended, America changed its priorities. Ships that had once been essential were suddenly expensive problems. Scrap prices fell. Maintenance costs rose. Environmental laws did not yet exist. The easiest solution was also the quietest. Tow them out, strip what you can, leave the rest. No headlines, no public debate, no record books. By the early 1950s, the Arthur Kill had become something no one planned, a slow, silent repository of American industrial memory. One tugboat, built in Brooklyn in 1917, had pushed coal barges through the East River for decades. During the war, it escorted ammunition ships through submarine-infested waters. Its crew logs mention fog so thick men could not see their own hands. They navigated by listening, counting horn echoes, measuring distance by sound. In 1946, the tug was declared obsolete. Its engine was removed. Its name was painted over. It was towed once more, not to a dock, but to shallow water. There it settled. Decade by decade, the river claimed it. Mud rose along its hull. Rust split its steel ribs. Birds nested where sailors once slept. Fish swam through engine rooms that had roared day and night during the largest war in human history. Multiply that story by 100. Each ship in the Arthur Kill has a past. Each one touched lives. Each one carried part of America's rise, and each one was forgotten on purpose. What makes this graveyard different from others is not how the ships died, but how they continue to exist. Storms expose them. Tides reveal names long erased. Steel ribs rise like skeletons at low tide, reminding anyone who looks closely that history does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. Environmental scientists now warn that these ships still bleed into the water: oil, heavy metals, asbestos. The past is not just remembered here, it is active. It seeps, it moves. Historians, divers, photographers, and local residents have tried to document the graveyard, but much remains unknown. Records were lost, ownership vanished. Some vessels were never properly registered. Others were renamed so many times their true identities dissolved. This is America's unintended archive, written not in ink, but in rust. And the Arthur Kill is only the beginning, because once you start looking, you realize something disturbing. The United States is filled with places like this: forgotten infrastructure, abandoned victories, silent witnesses to ambition without foresight. The ship graveyard of New York does not ask for attention. It does not demand sympathy. It simply waits, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to remember, waiting for someone to tell the story before the river finally erases it completely. And this is that story. By 1941, New York Harbor no longer slept. Long before the United States officially entered World War II, the harbor had already become a battlefield, just not one marked by explosions or gunfire. This was a war of logistics, secrecy, endurance, and constant fear. German U-boats were active along the Atlantic coast. Their commanders knew something American civilians did not yet fully understand. If you could choke the supply lines, you could cripple an enemy without ever setting foot on its soil. New York was the heart of those supply lines. Every crate of ammunition, every tank engine, every sack of flour destined for Europe passed through these waters. And every one of those ships depended on smaller vessels, the tugboats, to move safely. At night, the city went dark. Blackout regulations demanded that buildings extinguish lights, bridges dimmed, ships sailed without navigation lights. The harbor, once glowing like a living organism, became a shadowed maze of steel and water. Tugboat captains learned to trust instinct more than sight. They memorized shoreline shapes. They counted seconds between horn blasts. They felt currents through the wheel, sensing invisible obstacles through vibrations in the hull. Crew logs from 1942 described near collisions avoided by inches. One entry reads simply, "Visibility 0, guided tanker by sound alone. No damage, crew shaken." These were not trained naval officers. Many tugboat crewmen had started as dockhands, fishermen, or immigrants seeking steady work. They learned under pressure because failure was not an option. A single mistake could mean a ship grounded in shallow water, an easy target for enemy submarines waiting offshore. The Liberty ships that filled the harbor were massive, hastily constructed, and fragile in ways few civilians realized. Built quickly to meet wartime demand, they required careful handling. Their welded hulls could crack under stress. Their steering was sluggish. Without tugboats, many could not dock or depart safely at all. One Liberty ship carrying medical supplies and replacement aircraft parts nearly ran aground during a fog-heavy departure in early 1943. Tugboats pushed against its flanks, engines straining. Crew members shouted directions they could barely hear themselves over wind and machinery. The ship made it out. No newspaper reported the incident. No medals were awarded. The tugboats returned to work the next morning. Fear was constant, but rarely spoken aloud. Harbor workers whispered about sightings, dark shapes in the water, unexplained explosions offshore, oil slicks appearing without warning. Officially, the Navy downplayed the threat. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. German submarines sank dozens of ships off the East Coast. Fires burned so brightly at sea that people watched them from beaches. In response, the harbor tightened its grip. Patrol boats increased. Mines were rumored to be placed in channels. Tugboats were ordered to vary routes, schedules, and signals to avoid patterns, and still the work continued. Some tugboats served double duty. By day, they guided commercial traffic. By night, they assisted Navy vessels or escorted sensitive cargo. Crews slept when they could, often on deck, wrapped in coats, breathing oil-scented air. One crewman later recalled that time blurred, days merged, seasons changed unnoticed. The war was measured not in headlines, but in tides. When America finally emerged victorious, celebration swept the city. Parades filled streets. Flags waved from windows. Soldiers returned home. The harbor, for the first time in years, slowed. And that was when the problem revealed itself. Hundreds of vessels had been built, purchased, leased, or repurposed for war. Now they were no longer needed. The Navy sold surplus ships at bargain prices. Private companies bought what they could use and ignored the rest. Tugboats that had worked for decades were suddenly liabilities. They were old. They burned fuel inefficiently. They required repairs no one wanted to pay for. Environmental regulations did not yet exist. There was no requirement to dismantle a ship responsibly. There was no public pressure to preserve industrial history. There was only cost and convenience. The Arthur Kill offered both. Shallow, slow-moving, and largely out of public view, it became a convenient place to tow unwanted hulls. Engines were stripped. Valuable metal was salvaged. Names were removed or painted over. Then the lines were cut. Some vessels settled immediately. Others drifted until mud claimed them. Over time, more ships joined them: fireboats, garbage barges, oil carriers, ferry hulls. Each one arrived quietly. No one announced the creation of a ship graveyard. It simply formed. Local residents noticed slowly. Fishermen snagged nets on submerged steel. Children spotted rusted shapes at low tide. Workers driving over bridges glimpsed hulls rising from mud like the backs of enormous animals. Most people assumed they were temporary. They were not. As decades passed, the graveyard became permanent, yet unofficial. It appeared on no tourist maps. It was rarely discussed. Even city records struggled to identify how many ships lay there or who owned them. History slipped into silence. By the 1970s, New York faced new crises: economic decline, crime, pollution. Attention turned elsewhere. The ships remained, aging, corroding, leaking slowly into the water. Nature adapted faster than people did. Birds nested in wheelhouses, fish sheltered beneath hulls, plants took root in accumulated sediment. What humans abandoned, the ecosystem absorbed, though not without consequence. Heavy metals settled into the riverbed. Oil residues lingered. The past continued to affect the present in ways unseen. And still, few people asked questions. It would take decades before scientists, historians, and filmmakers would begin to understand what the Arthur Kill truly represented. Not just a dumping ground, but a physical record of American choices: war, industry, convenience, forgetting. And beneath it all, the quiet persistence of steel that refused to vanish. By the time the first serious attempts were made to document the ships of the Arthur Kill, most of the men who had worked on them were already old or gone. Their stories survived only in fragments: a name scribbled in a ledger, a photograph with no caption, a sea log stained by oil and salt water, a memory passed down at a kitchen table, half remembered, half dismissed as exaggeration. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. Many of the tugboat crews were immigrants or the sons of immigrants: Irish, Italian, Polish, Scandinavian. For them, the harbor was not just a workplace, it was opportunity. A tugboat job meant steady pay, union protection, and a sense of purpose. One former deckhand, interviewed in the late 1980s, described his first day on a tug in 1939. He was 19, newly hired, and terrified. The boat was small compared to the cargo ships it pushed, but the engine thundered like a living thing. "You didn't control the river," he said. "You negotiated with it." During the war, that negotiation became more dangerous. Crews were warned never to discuss routes or cargo in public. Bars near the docks were watched. Rumors of spies spread easily. Everyone assumed someone was listening. One tugboat, later identified through partial hull markings, had been tasked repeatedly with guiding tankers carrying aviation fuel. Its crew was instructed to change schedules daily. Sometimes they left hours early, sometimes hours late. No pattern. The captain kept no personal diary, but the ship's log survives. It mentions fog 14 times in a single month. Fog was the harbor's greatest enemy. It flattened sound. It swallowed distance. It turned familiar routes into traps. On one winter morning, visibility dropped so suddenly that a tugboat found itself nearly pinned between a tanker and a pier. The crew reacted instinctively, reverse thrust, hard rudder, shouted commands, drowned by engines. They escaped by less than a meter. No one wrote about it afterward. There was no time. Another tugboat assisted a Liberty ship whose hull had developed stress fractures. Welding repairs were rushed. Everyone knew the ship needed gentle handling, but war did not allow delays. The tugboat pushed carefully, engines low, crew silent. That Liberty ship crossed the Atlantic and returned months later, empty, scarred, but intact. The tugboat that helped it would never leave the harbor again. When peace came, the men expected gratitude, or at least continuity. Instead, many were laid off, contracts ended, boats were sold, stripped, or sidelined. Some crew members watched helplessly as vessels they had served on for decades were towed away for scrap or abandonment. They were not consulted. No one asked if the ships meant something to them. One former engineer described seeing his tug for the last time from a bridge. It sat low in the water, engine removed, name gone. It looked like it had been erased, he said. That erasure was not accidental. During the post-war industrial shift, America was focused on the future: jet engines, highways, suburbs, television. Old ships did not fit the image of progress. Preservation was for monuments and battlefields, not working boats that smelled of oil and sweat. So the ships remained undocumented. By the time environmental awareness rose in the late 19th century, the problem had become complex. No one knew exactly how many vessels lay in the Arthur Kill. Ownership was unclear. Some companies no longer existed. Others denied responsibility. Removing the ships risked stirring contaminated sediment. Leaving them posed long-term pollution risks. The graveyard had become both historical artifact and environmental hazard. Researchers began approaching it cautiously. They used sonar to detect submerged hulls. They compared old insurance records with Coast Guard filings. They studied rivet patterns, hull shapes, and steel composition to date vessels whose names were long gone. Each identification felt like resurrecting a ghost. One tugboat was finally matched to records from a Brooklyn shipyard in 1918. Its build number corresponded to wartime contracts. Crew rosters were found in a separate archive, misfiled under commercial towing. Suddenly, a nameless hull became a vessel with a past. It had pushed coal barges through frozen rivers. It had escorted wartime tankers. It had carried men who worried about making rent, not making history. Now it rested in mud. The Arthur Kill was no longer just a dumping ground. It was a cross-section of American life. War, labor, migration, ambition, neglect. And the deeper researchers looked, the clearer it became that this was not an isolated case. The ship graveyard reflected a national habit: build fast, use hard, move on quietly. The ships did not sink in dramatic battles. They were not victims of enemy fire. They were casualties of convenience. And yet, they endured. Every storm shifted sediment. Every tide revealed new details. A propeller here, a deck edge there. The past refused to stay buried. By the early 2000s, photographers and filmmakers had begun documenting the site. Their images spread online. For the first time, the public glimpsed what had been hidden for decades. Reactions were mixed: fascination, concern, disbelief. How could this exist in New York? How could so much history be left behind? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, lay in plain sight. America had been looking forward for so long that it forgot to look down, and the river remembered everything.
Long before historians tried to catalog the wrecks, the river had already collected its own stories. Stories whispered by dock workers, fishermen, and ferry captains who passed the Arthur Kill at dawn or dusk, when the water looked thick and metallic, and the silhouettes of dead ships seemed to lean toward one another like conspirators. Some of those stories reached back even further than World War II. During Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal but demand was endless, New York Harbor became a maze of shadows. Rum runners used every trick available: false manifests, hidden compartments, coded radio calls. Barges and tugboats were perfect tools. They blended in. They were everywhere. No one paid close attention. Later research would suggest that several vessels now rotting in the ship graveyard once played quiet roles in that underground economy. There are no official records confirming it. There wouldn't be. But circumstantial evidence is strong. One partially submerged barge, its deck warped and split, was found to contain reinforced bulkheads not listed in its construction plans. Another tug showed signs of repeated hull modifications, patches laid over patches, as if something inside needed constant access. A retired customs officer, interviewed anonymously, claimed that in the early 1930s, certain tug crews were untouchable. They weren't mobsters, he said. They were workers, but they worked for people who were. Those people moved liquor from offshore ships into the city under cover of darkness. The tugboats pushed barges that looked empty or full of coal or garbage. In reality, cases of Canadian whiskey lay beneath false floors. When Prohibition ended, some of those vessels returned to legitimate work. Others were quietly retired. Their pasts were inconvenient. Better to let them disappear. The Arthur Kill offered a solution. By the 1940s, the river was already crowded with industrial traffic. Scrapyards lined the shore. No one asked many questions. If a ship was old, damaged, or no longer profitable, it could be tied up and forgotten. Then came the war, and everything accelerated. Fireboats joined the harbor fleet, specialized vessels designed to combat blazes on docks, and ships loaded with fuel or munitions. These boats were powerful, expensive, and vital. They saved lives.
They prevented disasters that never made headlines because they never happened. One such fireboat worked the Staten Island side of the harbor throughout the war years. Its pumps could move thousands of gallons per minute. Its crew trained relentlessly. After the war, newer technology made it obsolete. The city decommissioned it quietly. Decades later, a rusted hull matching its dimensions was identified in the ship graveyard. The pumps were gone, the nameplate missing, but the reinforced superstructure and unique intake ports told the story. A hero reduced to scrap. Garbage barges also played a major role in the river's history. New York produced unimaginable amounts of waste, even in the early 20th century. Before modern sanitation systems, barges carried trash out of the city daily. Some of those barges leaked, some caught fire, some were damaged beyond economical repair. Rather than tow them far for disposal, companies often moved them just far enough out of the way. The Arthur Kill again. Layer by layer, the graveyard grew, not through a single decision, but through thousands of small ones. It was cheaper to abandon than to dismantle, easier to forget than to document. By the 1950s and 60s, the river had become something else entirely. Chemical plants lined the shore, petroleum facilities expanded. Waste, industrial and otherwise, entered the water in quantities that would shock modern observers. Ships abandoned there didn't just rust, they absorbed pollution. Their steel trapped toxins, their holds filled with sediment that carried decades of chemical history. The graveyard became toxic memory made physical. And yet, life adapted. Fish returned in small numbers. Birds nested on hulls that rose above the waterline. Oysters clung to metal ribs. Nature began reclaiming what industry had discarded. This uneasy coexistence drew scientists in later decades. They studied how ecosystems formed around wrecks, how artificial reefs developed accidentally, how decay created habitat. History and biology intertwined. One environmental researcher described the site as a museum that's alive and poisonous. Public awareness remained low until the internet changed everything. Photographs circulated. Drone footage revealed the scale. Headlines used words like secret and forgotten. Suddenly, the Arthur Kill ship graveyard was no longer invisible. People wanted answers. How many ships? Who put them there? Why hadn't they been removed? The truth frustrated everyone. There was no single villain, no master plan, just a system that valued efficiency over memory. As pressure mounted, agencies debated cleanup. Some ships were removed. Others were deemed too dangerous to disturb. Each decision sparked controversy. Remove them, and you erase history. Leave them, and you risk contamination. There was no perfect solution. And beneath those debates lay a deeper question, one that Americans rarely ask themselves. What do we do with the things that built us once we no longer need them? The Arthur Kill had an answer, but it was not a comfortable one. It reminded the nation that progress leaves wreckage behind, and that wreckage has a way of resurfacing. By the time government agencies finally turned their full attention to the Arthur Kill, The question was no longer what the ship graveyard was, but how much of it could even be understood, because counting the ships turned out to be far more difficult than anyone expected. From the air, the visible wrecks seemed manageable, a few dozen hulls, some half-sunk, some barely rising above the waterline. But sonar surveys told a different story. Beneath the surface lay layers, ships on ships, hulls overlapping like fallen dominoes, some crushed by time, others preserved eerily well in oxygen-poor mud. Early estimates suggested around 50 vessels. Later studies pushed the number past 70. Then came a revised figure, more than 100 distinct hulls, depending on how fragments were classified. And even that number came with an asterisk, because no one could agree on what counted as a ship. Was a broken barge still a vessel if its stern was missing? Did a fireboat stripped of its superstructure still qualify as historic? If two wrecks had fused together through corrosion, were they one or two? These weren't academic questions. They carried legal and financial consequences. Ownership became the central nightmare. Some ships belonged to companies that still existed, on paper. Others traced back to firms that had merged, dissolved, or vanished entirely. In some cases, ownership transferred multiple times without proper documentation. One investigation uncovered a tugboat whose last registered owner had died in the 1940s. The company he worked for had been sold twice, then liquidated. Its assets had scattered across states. No living entity could be clearly held responsible. And without an owner, no one could be forced to pay for removal. Federal agencies hesitated, state agencies argued jurisdiction, city authorities pointed to environmental regulators. Everyone agreed the ships were a problem, but no one wanted the bill. Legal battles dragged on for years. Environmental groups demanded cleanup, citing pollution risks. Preservationists argued that the graveyard represented irreplaceable industrial history. Local residents worried about safety, toxins, and neglected infrastructure. Each side was right, and each side was trapped. One proposed plan suggested removing only the most dangerous wrecks, those leaking oil or chemicals. Another proposed turning the site into a protected historical zone. A third quietly suggested leaving it alone and letting nature finish the job. None fully succeeded. A few vessels were dismantled under strict environmental controls. Their removal revealed how deep the problem went. Sediment beneath them tested positive for heavy metals, hydrocarbons, and chemicals no longer even manufactured. Disturbing the wrecks stirred decades of buried pollution. In some cases, it was safer to leave them exactly where they were. The ship graveyard became a paradox, too toxic to touch, too historic to destroy, too inconvenient to fully preserve. Meanwhile, the ships continued to decay. Steel weakened, hulls collapsed inward, names once carved proudly vanished under rust. The longer the debate lasted, the more history dissolved into anonymity. Yet fragments of human stories kept surfacing. During a survey dive, researchers found a pair of heavy boots still resting near a collapsed engine room. No body, just the boots. No one knew if they had been left behind or removed from someone who never returned. Another team recovered a corroded bell. Its inscription was partially legible. The ship's name could be reconstructed letter by letter. That bell had once rung to signal shifts, emergencies, arrivals. Now it lay silent, finally acknowledged. What made the Arthur Kill unique was not just the number of ships, but the types. This was not a naval graveyard in the traditional sense. There were no battleships sunk in combat. Instead, there were tugboats, barges, ferries, fireboats, service vessels, the infrastructure of everyday America. These ships fed cities, moved fuel, carried garbage, saved burning docks, built skylines. They were never meant to be remembered, and that, perhaps, was the most unsettling truth. American history often celebrates moments of glory, wars won, bridges built, rockets launched. But the Arthur Kill told a quieter story, one of labor, neglect, and disposal. A story of things used until they could no longer be useful. As documentaries and long-form videos began reaching wider audiences, viewers reacted strongly. Many had lived in New York their entire lives without knowing this place existed. Others saw reflections of their own industries, the factories closed, the tools abandoned, the jobs forgotten. The ship graveyard stopped being just about ships. It became about memory. And memory, once awakened, demands answers. Why were these vessels never honored? Why were the people who worked them erased alongside the steel? Why did progress require forgetting? The Arthur Kill did not answer out loud. It simply remained, rusting, silent, undeniable, waiting.
Friends, what you just watched is only part one of this incredible story. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now and stay tuned for part two.